Chapter 1 Paladin Power. Spring 4978, 10th of Crudamoth. The streets were always quieter after a big celebration. The spring equinox, in particular, was a day of new beginnings and ceremonies. Youths that had reached maturity the previous year were given the test of divine compatibility. Apprentices who had earned their journeyman status were elevated officially, and more marriages were performed on that day than any other. Throughout the kingdom, families and communities held feasts for their closest friends, celebrating these beginnings and reaffirming their bonds for the following year. In Clearhelm, citizens often stayed up late into the night, drinking and toasting the end of winter for the second time, now that it finally felt over. The snow in this northernmost province had finally melted completely, and the sun had returned to take up the majority of the day. And though the early morning breeze wouldn't lose its chill for another month at least, Sean didn't care. And the other children running ahead of him on the empty streets didn't seem to mind either, their short cloaks flapping open as they dodged around the rare adult up early despite the night of heavy drinking. This particular gang of boys consisted of only 5. The 2 oldest would reach maturity in time for the following spring equinox, and the next was 10. But Sean and Gavin were only 7, and the 2 were just happy to be included in this group of more mature boys. The most senior led the others to the city walls, making a show of slipping behind boxes and looking carefully around corners the closer they got to the city border. Sean couldn't help but roll his eyes as Gavin tried to imitate them, sneaking their way to the wall, though they were all allowed to be there, so long as they stayed inside it. The stone walls surrounding the city proper were 20 feet tall and 6 feet thick, wide enough for guards to patrol the top and for war machines to struggle to penetrate. But the kingdom hadn't seen war for over 4,000 years. Not since the warring kingdoms were united into provinces by St. Georgos of the United Kingdom of Danalan. The children, kept safe from the dangers supposedly ever present outside the city, assumed the Temple of Hengeist was merely paranoid and that they didn't need to be kept behind the great walls anymore. If anyone asked them, the kids would say that the walls around Smidna were meant to keep them in, and as such was seen as a challenge. The boys ran along the base of the wall towards the northwest, where abandoned tents and shacks still leaned against the solid stone border. According to the posters on nearly every rickety door or ragged canvas flap, the temporary refugee housing would be fully dismantled in the following month. The refugees had left for their rebuilt homes the previous week, celebrating the spring equinox back in their rebuilt town. For them, it was even more of a new beginning than previous years. Sean tried to keep his eyes on all of his fellow children as they ran ahead and snuck around, doing their best to keep to the shadows before ducking into a particularly solid-looking shanty leaning against the wall. He felt nervous for some reason he couldn't fully explain. The others seemed excited by the prospect of being able to slip out of the city. Shouldn't he too? But they weren't sneaking out just for fun or pretend. This was very much against the rules. They all knew it, and yet they did it anyway. It left a solid weight in the pit of Sean's stomach, more reminiscent of guilt than fear. "Here," the oldest boy whispered, while his fellow pulled at the planks making up the far wall of the shack. The first board slipped free, revealing part of the city wall, but the second showed a dark crack, the edge of a tunnel. Gavin rushed forward to help them with the third and fourth planks, fully exposing a rough passage through the wall. Only 2 feet across and 4 tall, it was barely large enough for the kids and would have been far too tight a squeeze for an adult, which was probably why it hadn't been properly repaired with stone. "Are you sure it goes all the way through?" the 10-year-old whispered, squinting into the darkness. The oldest planted his fists on his hips and nodded with a broad smile. "Yep! Laura told me about it when she was staying here, before the church found out her parents were gone. It twists once about halfway through, so you can't see light, but if you put your hand here," he demonstrated, placing his hand in the middle of the crack, "you can feel a breeze." "I'll go first," the next oldest stated, sprinting forward and knocking his fellow's hand out of the way. He had to shimmy into the crack sideways, his knees bent awkwardly to bring himself low enough. The oldest followed at a weird half-crawl, neither waiting for the others. The 10-year-old swallowed, but followed the older boys. Gavin glanced at Sean, who hadn't moved from the door. "Coming?" Gavin asked, a little nervousness slipping into his voice. The small show of fear had Sean steeling himself and nodding. He wouldn't let Gavin go by himself. His friend smiled gratefully, then ducked down and into the crack, waiting just a foot in for Sean to follow. Sean and Gavin didn't have to struggle in the tight space as much as the older and larger boys, so they found themselves waiting as they caught up quickly. "Fuck! Give me a minute," the lead boy called out. The echoing scrape of wood on stone followed as he shifted something up ahead. Sean could feel Gavin shaking ahead of him. His friend didn't like tight spaces or the dark. Sean clenched his fists and slipped his hands behind his back, feeling that if he accidentally touched Gavin now, he might give the brave boy a heart attack. "What's taking so long?" the 10-year-old hissed in a whisper loud enough that Sean wondered why he didn't bother to just speak normally. One last slide and grunt accompanied the answer. "Got it!" spoken just as loud from ahead. The boy started moving again, and soon Gavin was stumbling out of the crack, breathing heavily and leaning against the wall for support. Sean slipped out next to him, his blue eyes concerned and focused only for his friend, who smiled weakly before he let his own gaze slip past Sean and into the distance, his mouth going slack. Sean turned and saw the outside world for the first time. The land around Smyrna was clear for at least 100 feet, with long grass waving in the breeze. Beyond that, thick pines blocked the horizon and cast dark shadows onto the field. "Wow! So much space!" The 10-year-old didn't bother to whisper anymore. The oldest boys exchanged mischievous looks and nodded before they turned together, and the most senior said, "Race you to the trees!" Then they both sprinted across the grass, leaving the younger three to scramble to keep up. Sean stood frozen in place as a strong gust caused the grass to roll like waves and the distant trees to creak and scrape against each other, sounding almost like rain. "Come on, Sean!" Gavin called, turning to wave and nearly tripping over his own feet. Sean shook himself and sprinted after them. He thought the parks in the Nobles districts had been open. But this was freedom. He caught up to Gavin, who was laughing too much to keep up his speed, when he caught a glimpse of Sean out of the corner of his eye. Gavin growled and bowled ahead, not willing to come in last. Sean let him go, preferring to keep everyone in view anyway, though his eyes drifted to the treetops dancing in the breeze, feeling as free as the wind outside the city walls. Rasna sighed, leaning down in her saddle to pat Darhar hard on the neck. The horse snorted and shook his shaggy mane, appreciating the attention, and the paladin smiled. "Sirs!" The gate guard snapped to attention, saluting sharply to the 3 paladins in their wagon as they rode leisurely through the north gate. "Safe travels, General!" Rasna nodded curtly while her 2 subordinates returned the guard's salute. She scanned the trees ahead and sighed as the first gust of unhindered wind blew over the grass. The wagon rattled behind them, adding its creaking song to that of the dancing trees. It had been a full year since she'd left the city, though then she had gone south. "Back to Hammerfoss," the paladin to her right whispered. "Can't believe it's only been a year, can you?" the other asked, the smile clear enough in his voice that Rasna didn't have to look to know it was there. "I remember when I took my oath," he sighed, the memory a happy one. "It always was. This'll be my first time back since then." "How long ago were you in training?" the junior asked. 5 years. "And you, sir?" The junior directed his question to Rasna, trying to include her. She turned her head just a little to arch a gray eyebrow at him. He blushed. I know the girls train in Helmsworth, but nearly 40 years, Sir Callan," Rasna answered with a crooked half-smile. "Though Helmsworth is nearly an exact replica of Hammerfoss. Perhaps you'll see it some day." She reined in Darhar enough to allow the 2 men to catch up while the wagon trudged along slowly behind. She continued, back to business. "We have 4 graduates this year. As you know, they had their vigil last night and will take their official oaths when we arrive to greet our new brothers with their orders. I expect you both to remain professional. They are no longer squires, and neither are you. The Temple of Hengeist—" Rasna's voice trailed off, feeling a pull in her chest. A whisper on the wind had her signaling Darhar to a full stop, and turning him west, scanning the tree line. "Do you feel that?" she asked her subordinates. "General?" Callan asked curiously. The more senior started, then stopped, pulling up beside Rasna. His eyes followed hers along the tree line and around the curve of the city wall. "What is it?" Rasna took a deep breath and closed her eyes, seeking the warm, guiding light always burning in her heart and soul. Her eyes snapped open. "Sir Callan," she turned to the youngest knight, Darhar dancing nervously below her. "Stay with the wagon. Sir Garn, with me." They didn't question her as she kicked Darhar into a canter, following the whisper of a feeling sent by their god. "I'll be Sir Gallant!" The 10-year-old picked up a long stick from the edge of the forest, holding it aloft like a sword. He declared, "I wield the mighty sword Longfollow!" Sean rolled his eyes, not bothering to correct the older boy, but Gavin didn't hold back. Laughing, he said, "Gallant didn't wield Longfollow. He held Far-Acre!" Gavin picked up his own stick and swung it slowly at the 10-year-old, who laughed and hit the pretend sword with his own. They were both wrong. Sean stayed quiet. "What are you doing?" the eldest boy asked his fellow, ignoring the younger kids to watch his friend pull himself up and peek into the hollow in one of the larger trees further in. Looking for a pseudo-dragon nest, his friend answered simply. The 10-year-old stopped his sword fight to sneer at the older boys. Those aren't real. They are, the two exclaimed in unison, causing all three of the others to blink in shock before they explained. We saw one. A mage in the guild has one as a pet. No way! What did it look like? Gavin and the 10-year-old rushed the older boys, trying to jump and see into the tree hollow as if it hadn't already been checked. Sean walked to join them, just as interested in the story of the miniature dragons as the others, but able to contain his excitement in a way they obviously couldn't. He said that pseudo-dragons look exactly like real dragons used to, only smaller, the oldest boy explained sagely. The 10-year-old huffed in disbelief. And how would they even know? All the real dragons were killed off 1,000 years ago. 5,000. Sean thought the correction, but didn't bother to voice it. It didn't matter if it had been 5,000 years or 1,000. The point was the dragons were all dead and had been for a very long time. Deep in the woods, a twig snapped. The oldest boy opened his mouth to argue, but Sean lunged forward and grabbed his arm, holding his finger to his lips. The boy pulled away from Sean's grip, nearly tripping and rubbing his arm where Sean had touched him. Completely ignoring the younger boy's warning to be silent, he shouted, "What the hell? Why are you always so fucking cold?" But Gavin at least saw the look on Sean's face and hissed at the eldest to be quiet. They all heard the second snap, followed closely by a crunch of a pine cone only a few yards away. 5 pairs of scared eyes scanned the woods, seeing nothing. 5 pairs of shaking legs moved slowly back towards the field and the city walls. Sean felt the low growl rumble in his chest before he heard it. "Run!" Gavin screamed, throwing his stick into the trees just as a beast as tall as he was crashed through the underbrush. The boys sprinted into the open field. Ahead of Sean, the 10-year-old tripped, sprawling in the grass and dropping his stick. The beast snarled and Sean dipped, picking up the stick and turning to face the monster while the 10-year-old tried to crawl back to his feet. The Dracwolf was at least 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with tattered leathery wings the same muddy brown as its scales sprouting from sharply protruding shoulder blades. Shaped like an emaciated wolf, its ribs could be seen clearly shifting below its flesh. Its pointed tongue hung limply from its mouth, drool dangling like slimy ropes from 2 rows of sharply jagged teeth. It stalked out of the shade of the trees, and Sean's arms shook as he held the stick in both his sweating hands. With a snarl, the Dracwolf pounced, and Sean swung. The stick cracked the monster across the face, but Sean wasn't prepared to see blood fly from its ribs as it fell to the ground. "Get back!" The woman's voice was a command that carried past sound and slammed into Sean's mind, compelling him to take a step back despite his shaking legs. 2 knights dismounted from their horses at a run, one with his sword already drawn, but they were still 10 yards away as the Dracwolf struggled to its feet again. The man sliced the air with his sword, and another cut appeared on the monster's neck. Scarlet blood splattered across Sean's face, and he fell back, dropping the stick, his body still trying to obey the woman's command. The female paladin sent in front of Sean and the other boys as 2 more Dracwolves crashed out of the forest, howling in rage. Sean could hear the other boys all clap their hands over their ears to block the sound of howling, but Sean was too transfixed to do even that much. The woman reached for his fallen stick, picking it up in her left hand as she drew her blade with her right. Both stick and sword began to glow with a soft blue-white light as the twin Dracwolves lunged, their wings flapping just enough to give them some extra speed and height. What had once been a simple stick was now a glowing sword in the woman's hand. She lifted the twin blades, refusing to sidestep and expose the boys to attack if she dodged. The left monster's jump was nearly over her head, and the woman stepped into it, lifting the stick-turned sword and slicing through the hard scales of its belly like paper, splashing herself in the ground in a wave of scarlet and entrails. The right monster ducked below her right-hand swing and latched onto her knee, twisting as it bit, denting armor and ripping flesh before dodging away from the paladin's counter. The paladin didn't cry out in pain. Instead, Sean watched as she let out a slow breath and stepped forward on a leg that was being healed before his eyes. "Hengeist, take you," she breathed, and brought her sword down. She sliced into the Dracwolf's shoulder and sent it slamming into the ground. It struggled to stand, but the paladin merely flicked the blood from her blade. The cut along its shoulder exploded in a shower of gore and blue light, spreading until it circled the beast and it fell in 2 pieces back to the ground. Sean snapped his mouth closed and shielded his eyes from the red rain as the male paladin ran the rest of the way to them, yelling, "General Rasna, are they all right?" He slid on his knees to Sean, reaching for him. "Are you hurt, boy?" Sean pulled away just as the knight's hand grasped his arm. The paladin jerked back in surprise, and Sean muttered, "I'm fine," before the paladin could say anything else. "What are you doing out here?" The woman turned, removing her helm, and Sean finally got a good look at her face. She wasn't as young as he'd assumed by the way she moved. She had gray hair, the same steely color as her eyes, and lines around her scowling mouth as she arched a severe-looking eyebrow at the boys. She hadn't yelled, but the other 4 boys all flinched, looking to the ground in shame and fear. We were sent to gather," the oldest started to lie. "We snuck through the wall," Sean interrupted with the truth, and all 4 choked. Sean ignored them, looking up at the knight, who continued to stare, so he elaborated. "We've never been outside the city before, so we snuck out through a crack in the wall." He waited for the paladin to start yelling, but they didn't. "Show me," the woman said coldly, gesturing for the city with the stick, now back to normal, before tossing it aside. The boys all turned in silence, still staring at the ground as they walked ahead across the open field back to the wall. Sean saw them shooting angry glances his way, but he continued to ignore them, focusing on his feet and replaying the fight in his head again and again, trying to memorize every detail. "Your parents?" the male paladin, much younger than the woman, demanded as they walked. "We don't," Gavin started. "The church," the 10-year-old said weakly. The woman understood. "I will be speaking to Father Branston directly." Sean flinched, not sure if, in this circumstance, if the normally kindly abbot would be better or worse than the strict matron. The paladin's horses caught up to them at a lazy walk, without being called, as the boys reached the wall. The male knight sighed, kicking the large plank that had blocked the side of the crack, while the woman stared coldly at the boy's once-hidden passage. "Looks like it was blocked by the refugees, General," the male observed. All 5 of the boys nodded, still looking at the ground. The woman's voice was calm and even. "I want the names of everyone who patrolled this part of the wall in the last 2 months on my desk by the time I return from Hammerfoss. There is no excuse for such negligence." The junior knight didn't argue. Saluting sharply to his superior, he picked up the plank and replaced it over the crack. "You 5, come with me." The general turned north, her horse and the boys following obediently. The abbot's office was on the 2nd floor of the northern portion of the church complex. Situated behind and above the worship hall, it had full-sized windows on both the east and west walls, from just above the floor to just below the ceiling, which had extensive skylights. Like a miniature version of the chapel below, the light of Soleil shone through no matter the time of day. Sean had never had reason to be in the abbot's office before now. He stood silently with the rest of the boys as Sir Rasna told Father Branston what had happened outside the city. They all braced for an explosion, but the abbot just sighed, leaning forward on his desk and lacing chubby fingers together in front of his face. "Are we going to be arrested?" the 10-year-old asked in a nervous whisper. Still facing the floor, Sean glanced up to see Sir Rasna arching a steely eyebrow at them. Father Branston sighed again. "Leaving the city is not against the law, young man. Only the rules. If anyone is going to be tried for this, it would be me." Sean looked up in shock, but Sir Rasna just snorted. "Don't be overly dramatic, Branston," she said calmly. "You didn't send the boys out. This was not reckless endangerment on your part, merely reckless stupidity on theirs." Father Branston closed his eyes and shook his head. "Thank Soleil you were in the area, Rasna." He turned sad eyes to the boys. "All 3 of you will be grounded a full month for this, with extra chores and a 3-page essay as to why you are not allowed outside of the city without reason or protection." The oldest boys both choked. The 10-year-old whined. Sean nodded solemnly, and Gavin spluttered, "But why? Why can't we go outside?" Sean shot a glare at his friend out of the corner of his eye. It was a stupid question, but Sir Rasna answered it anyway. "Besides the obvious risk of monster attack?" Gavin at least had the decency to blush, and she continued, "The area outside the city is not safe. Dracwolves, kobolds, draken, wolves, giants, and worse all prowl the woods." "And we didn't know where you were," the abbot added, pushing off his desk and climbing to his feet. "If Sir Rasna hadn't been guided by Hinggeist to save you, we would have had no idea that anything had even happened. Even if you hadn't been killed, you could have been injured, and no one would know where you were to help." He finally looked angry and not just disappointed, though his voice remained calm. "No rule or law is without reason. They are to protect you, to keep you safe and alive. Even I can't raise the dead, and that is exactly what you would have been had those Dracwolves caught you." "We didn't," the oldest boy started, but Branston continued past him. "You risked not only your lives, but the lives of all those who may have heard about it and tried for themselves. If you hadn't been hurt or caught, more would have tried the same, thinking it was safe. The abbot let out a frustrated breath, sitting heavily again, still just as calm and disappointed in his words. There are consequences to your actions, boys. I'm just glad this time it's only a punishment and not your life. He waved a fat hand to the door, dismissing them. Trailing behind the others, Sean looked up to see Sir Rasna watching them, while Branston rubbed his face with both hands. The knight met Sean's eye and held up a hand, signaling him to stop. You, boy, a word. At her words, Branston hummed, looking past his palms to Sir Rasna, then down at Sean in question. What's your name? Rasna asked as Sean turned back to the office. The door clicked shut behind him, the others leaving him alone with the adults. Sean? She nodded curtly, clasping her hands behind her back. I know the others wanted to lie about why you were all out there. I hope you know why you're not getting a lesser punishment despite your honesty. Sean nodded. Sir Rasna waited for more, then finally prompted. Explain, Sean. I want to be sure you understand. I broke the rule. Telling you or not doesn't change that. Sean looked to the door where his friends had left. He honestly thought that they had all gotten off easy, though if some of that was due to his confession or not, he wasn't sure, and it really didn't matter, so he didn't say anything more. Father Branston cleared his throat, but when Sean turned to the abbot, the man wasn't looking at him. He was talking to Sir Rasna. You should know, Ras, that Sean is the boy who was left with your temple. Sean scrunched his face in confusion, and the Lady Knight's eyebrows shot into the sky in surprise. She looked at Sean again with a new focus that made him shift uncomfortably where he stood. He did hit one of the beasts with a stick, but I didn't want to encourage such behavior. Sean could feel his face flush, and he looked down. It had been stupid. If it hadn't been for the paladins, the monster would have simply attacked him, then the fallen 10-year-old. But Sean hadn't thought about that at the time. He'd simply acted, trying to give his companion time to run. The adults continued to speak to each other above him. You really feel he's meant for the temple, Branston? Sean's head shot up in time to see the abbot nod seriously. If he's able to pass the divine compatibility test, then I think all signs are there. You have to admit, they're rarely this clear. Sir Rasna hummed again. Perhaps. There is something about him. She addressed Sean. Do you know who your patron god is, Sean? Sean could only blink at the knight, and Branston answered for him. They'll be studying the gods more in depth in the coming weeks. Hengeist is my favorite, Sean muttered, then stopped as both adults focused on him again. Rasna made a gesture with her hand for him to continue, so Sean squared his shoulders. He was speaking to a member of the Temple of Hengeist, a divine instrument of the god in question. Hengeist fights evil and injustice. His knights are the most noble and could all do amazing things. Sean loved the stories of the Chosen of Hengeist. They were the most exciting, in his opinion, the most influential of all the gods' legends. Are you aware, Sean, that when you were born, you were not left in the care of the church? Sir Rasna asked coolly. Behind his desk, Father Branston looked sad and addressed the paladin instead of the boy. We don't like to speak of what brought the children into our care, Rasna. For many, it's painful to think about why or how they became orphans. Sean shook his head in response to both adults. He didn't really care why he was with the church. Whether his parents were alive or not, or why they had left him in the care of the province, it didn't matter. It wouldn't change anything anyway. For him, this was the only life he'd ever known, and overall it was a good one. I'm sorry, Rasna whispered, but then continued. But you should know that you were left on the doorstep of the Temple of Hengeist. We brought you here because it is the Church of Sulai who cares for children of the kingdom. Sean scrunched his face in question, and Branston answered, We think it may be a sign that you are destined for the temple, to be a cleric or a paladin of Hengeist, if you feel called to do so. Sean's eyes went wide, and Sir Rasna nodded in silent agreement with the abbot. It's something to consider, Rasna said, though we will not force you if you feel called to something else. Though always quiet, Sean found himself at a loss for words. Him? A paladin? He remembered the fight vividly from only a few hours previous, the way Sir Rasna had stood between him and the snarling Dracwolf, the way her sword had glowed and her wound had knit itself back together even while she fought. Paladins were the military and law of the province, equal with nobles. That someone like him could ever hope to be one someday? He thought of all the stories he'd memorized of the Knights of Hengeist, of how strong they were, and of all the good they'd done. Him? A paladin? Father Branston's voice broke through Sean's swirling thoughts. Such a possibility is still a few years off, Sean. Think about it. But for now, you should go. The matron will have your new chore schedule by the end of the day. Sean left the office with only a nod to show he'd heard. Wandering slowly down the stairs and through the chapel, his head swam with possibilities. Like the other children, he enjoyed pretending to be one of the great knights of old, fighting villains of Horsa and monsters like the dragon. But he hadn't put any real thought into what he might do when he was older. Could he really be a paladin? Was he meant to be a paladin? The possibilities seemed too good to be true, and yet Sean found himself daring to hope.